readers of God and Autobiography are fascinating people. Take Joel Weiner, for example. Lifelong businessman, good at math, good at accounting, he was called into the leadership of his local Jewish congregation and found himself responsible not only for finances, but for giving some sense of direction to the spiritual quest of the congregation was involved in. Let's talk to Joel now. Well, hello, Joel Weiner.
How are you, Jerry?
I'm very pleased to have you a chance to have this conversation with you. As you and I know, my wife Abigail is a member of the Jewish congregation, Temple Judea, and for a long time you were just a name to me because you would report either people participating in Torah study or what was going on at the temple, and you and some others are engaged in heroic leadership in the context of a temple that's gone through rough times, dealing with a period without a rabbi, for example, where you're giving both, handling the practical crises and also trying to and succeeding, as far as I could tell, in sustaining a valuable and in some ways innovative spiritual life. Anyway, having heard about you, it was a surprise to me when Abigail told me that I guess you had told her that you were reading God and Autobiography, and before it was published.
Before it was published, it was a blog on the internet.
Yeah, excerpts online. I thought that was remarkable. And if I could, let's go back before that event and just see talk a little bit about your spiritual background. In what sense were you raised Jewish? Because that's a different story for different people. And then where did your own thought and life take you after that, after your, might say, upbringing?
Sure. I was raised Jewish, grew up in Philadelphia.
Okay.
I was born in 1949, so, right in the middle of the baby boomers.
Mm-hmm.
I have two sisters, one older, one younger, so I was the only boy. Mm-hmm. I was the one, I was given the religious education, the girls were not.
Okay, that's the old style.
Right, my parents were not, I'll call it observant, but they were culturally Jewish, they identified as Jewish, they were keenly aware of the Holocaust after World War II.
Yes.
Actually, that news was trickling out and so forth.
Yes.
So it was important to live in a Jewish neighborhood and so forth, and I went to Hebrew school and so forth. So
yes.
I was a good student,
mm-hmm.
I'll tell you, the grades in Hebrew school goes Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, which is A, B, C, D, E. It's just the Hebrew alphabet. Yes. I got an A in Aleph, all A's in Aleph. I got all B's in Bet, all C's in Gimel, all D's in Dalet, and I did not finish Hey. I told my bar mitzvah was in September. And I told my father, I said, I am not going to synagogue one day after my bar mitzvah.
Oh, wow.
I just did not like it. I literally got psychosomatic headaches.
Wow.
About having to go to Hebrew school.
Yes.
And it was conservative. There was a Reform, conservative, and Orthodox. So that was like the middle of the road.
You're in the middle one.
And I was always, getting ahead of ourselves, but I became yes. a mathematician and a scientist and so forth. And I was always very rational.
Yes.
Logical thinker.
Yes.
And the way it was taught, it was a bunch of magic stories that just didn't hang together.
Yes.
I threw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, because I just said, no, I don't believe this. And I would have called, if you would ask, talk to me, Joel at 14, I would have said I was an atheist.
Yeah.
Sometimes I said I was an agnostic when I didn't want to get into an argument. But it was just, I stayed away from it.
Yes.
We got married. My son was, when he was born, I guess I was about 25. We were living in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
We sent him to KI, Knesset Israel, which is a large Reform congregation
mm-hmm.
In Elkins Park, very famous. And they gave free, with the nursery school, you got a free membership.
Okay.
And
so you became a member.
So we said, yeah, so we were a member. And Carol and I said, you know what, we're members. Okay, let's try it. And we went there it was a world of difference because the rabbi did not, at least this is the way it felt to me, he was not talking down to us. The sermons were very well prepared. First of all, the services were shorter, which I appreciated.
Yes.
The sermons were a big part of it, and they were, like I say, well prepared and not talking down to you as an adult, and also relevant to, and I forget what the topics were, of course, but they were.
But they're relevant.
They weren't just the Torah or something. It was well, here's what the sages or the rabbis would say, but here's what it means, and here's how we apply it to life. And so,
yes.
And that appealed to us. And so it was from that it grew, kind of a growing appreciation for the religion. And
you started seeing some depth in it, not just a bunch of stories like Greek myths or something like that.
Correct.
Yeah.
Now, again, jumping way ahead, we were always a member of a synagogue, and we moved to New York. We were living in Chicago. We lived in New York. And a lot of it was belonging and doing things because of the kids.
Sure.
A lot of parents do.
Yes.
And at Temple Judea, the previous rabbi, he knew that I was in business, and he saw something in me. He essentially suggested to the lay leadership at the time, get this guy on the board.
So he recruited you.
He recruited me. He wanted new blood on the board.
Yes.
So that's what happened. And
yes.
And I would still say, that was sort of like I knew I picked up things going along. And that was about the time that I read your book.
Really? That was about.
Well, I started going to Torah study. Carol and I like going to Torah study. I almost always I sit next to Abigail.
Yes.
She's a brilliant lady. I
know.
I totally respect
I'm a blessed man.
I totally respect her, and somehow or other, I think one day I said, why don't you bring your husband? And she said that, well, in fact, I go home and we talk about it. And
she tells me what everyone said. We read the verse.
Right.
She tells me, Joel said this and somebody else said that. We went around. She tells me what she said.
And she says, that's how we spend our Saturday morning. And so I don't eat breakfast there. I owe you a jury, and we talk about it. So
yeah,
and somewhere along the line, you and I met casually. But so as she mentioned the book,
I came to an event,
right? And so he's reading this book. I said, oh, interesting, and it was easy, and it was on the internet. And one of the things I appreciated about the book, the chapters. I mean, they were like little essays. They were a page and a half.
They're short. Yeah, it's got a lot of chapters, but they're short.
A lot of so you could read it and get an idea, and then go away from it. Or you could read 3 or 4 of them, and still short, and you can go away and come back, and so that's so I read it in sort of like bite-sized pieces over time, and I thought it was very engaging.
And that's what I recommend to people. I don't think it's a book to sit down and read through the way you read some books, in a week or something like that straight through. I think it's a book to be read in those small chapters, and then think about it, think about what it means, and think about its relevance to you.
Right.
Because it's not just it's like we're not reading the almanac or something. We're reading stuff relevant to people's lives, after all.
Right. And we'll come back and talk about the book. So to tell you about my sort of spiritual evolution.
Yes.
In the last year to year and a half, and partly because of my increasing responsibilities at Temple Judea, I started doing a lot of reading and a lot of talking to other rabbis and visiting other synagogues.
Yes.
And I have a friend since I've known from those KI days. He's still a friend of mine. His name is Rabbi Stephen Fink. He's in Baltimore, and I've called him and asked him questions. I've met with Rabbi Strom and so forth. And I've also gone to, for example, this is more recent, but my sister belongs to a synagogue called Pnei Or, which is of the Jewish Renewal. I'll call it a denomination. It's really an offshoot. It's a progressive Judaism thing. It's much smaller. It actually started in Germantown, section of Philadelphia. And it's very lively. I mean, there's a lot of music. It almost goes back to the Hasidic tradition, which I don't know if you know this, but the Baal Shem Tov in the Middle Ages the rabbis were it was all up in the head, and the rabbis were talking to themselves. And the Baal Shem Tov was a rabbi. I forget his real name. That was his nickname. That means the good name. And
Yes.
and he said it really should be something that the everyday people should experience, and that started the Hasidic movement. And so the melodies that, which is really live, it's like just feel it. Don't worry about what it means. Feel it. And it was a way of making it for the proletariat, and so the common person.
Sure, for everybody.
So I was searching for ways to help Temple Judea, and so that was the kinds of things I was doing. I also started doing a lot of reading. This is after your book, but your book was part of it. Mm-hmm. I started doing a lot of reading and talking to rabbis, and I came to the conclusion that the Reform movement, which is having troubles, by the way, all over the country, as are churches, as you probably know, it's really the evangelical Christians and the Orthodox Judaism, that they're growing, but most Christian faiths and most synagogues, they're losing members because in today's society when everything's, there's distractions that's out and the distractions, people.
And we're basically secular. The environment is a secular environment.
Right. And so I was looking for what is the real value of Temple Judea besides a parent or family saying, send your kid to religious school, have a bar bat mitzvah, and then they tend to drop out. I mean, some of them will stay, but it's like for people our age, like Abigail and you and I and Carol, it's like, what other than maybe a tradition, maybe a sense of guilt, what is it you're really getting out of it? Now, the Torah study group is something that, hey, when you go there and you're talking to other intelligent people and you're sharing things, that's valuable. But I was looking for something. So my spiritual growth has grown quite a bit in the last year because it's oversimplifying, but it's actually good to oversimplify. The Reform movement, when it started, remember we were talking about the Haskalah and the Enlightenment. When it started, they were trying to be very rational.
Yes.
And they were
modern science was important.
Exactly. This is in the 1850, 1860 time period. So
modern liberal values were important. Right.
And what happened is they lost, so it's like in the head and they lost the heart.
Yes.
It was so rational that it lost the spirit.
That's a wonderful way to put it, Joel. Yes.
And so now, like Jewish Renewal, as I tell you about, which started about 1960 with the hippie movement and so forth, it was a way of coming back and getting more music and so forth. Yeah, be progressive, be liberal in your thinking, be scientific in the sense that you can't deny science.
Right.
But on the other hand, try to bring back the spiritual aspects of it and so forth. So I started seeing value in all different sorts of ways of getting at it. In fact,
a very important lesson, Joel, for all of us. Yeah.
Right.
There's not just one road to truth, science or quantification or something. There are multiple roads and multiple aspects, and the heart is part of that. The heart, intuition, even rich stories that bring something out about life that would be hard to boil down to a set of precepts or moral rules or something. You come to understand life better from the kinds of stories told in the Torah, for example.
And well put. And that I would say was the theme of your book. I mean, and in fact, you talked about what was one passage, and I don't remember exactly where it was. I think it was relatively near the beginning. You're having a conversation with God.
Yes.
And obviously you're Christian background and so forth. And I was
raised Christian, unaffiliated after that.
Right. I forget how the conversation kind of went, but basically you were saying, well, what about Jesus? And God said, yeah, well, he's a good guy. Yeah, you can study him. And you said, well, is he like this? Is he your son? Is he the prophet? And he was not. He said, well, not necessarily, but you can study him. And well, what about Moses? Study him too. What about? And you were like trying to get God to say,
endorse one thing.
Endorse one thing, and God wouldn't do it.
Yeah, in a sense, they're all endorsed.
Right, exactly.
But in a sense, but except for the claim that each religious tradition tends to make that we're the only truth. It's not just that we're true, we're the only one. We're the whole truth, we're the only truth. And that, the God book, things I was told in the God book constantly push against that. or against an attempt to boil them all down to one, little creed or set of doctrines or one idea.
Right.
But you have to be open to the diversity of revelation.
Right. And so, and that's what I've learned, and that's what I think Judaism teaches. Now, Orthodox, I'm distinguished Orthodoxy from, I'm going to call it Reform, or let's call it Progressive Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the Torah, the Israelites are not Jews yet. The Israelites they're the chosen people. God has chosen Abraham, go do this, and then, and they're following their path and so forth.
Sure.
And actually, it's Jacob, I think, Jacob has a fight with an angel, and then,
right.
and then he wakes up with a limp and so forth, and then he changes his name to Israel, which is one who wrestles with angels.
Yes. Yes.
So that was the Israelites. The Israelites were people who wrestled with God.
Yes.
So,
which I do, in the God book all the time. I'm arguing.
Exactly.
Because I'll be told things either contradict my childhood upbringing, my understanding maybe from a Christian culture, or, I'm a professor of logic, so they just didn't seem logical.
Right.
And so I would object, and then God would patiently try to explain, how my concepts, which tend to always be either or, that's really not adequate. Not everything is an either or. Sometimes it's a both and. But for a logician, that's a challenging thought.
Right, exactly. So here's the two lessons that I learned. How do you deal with this chosenness thing? And
yes.
and I've asked rabbis about it, and they said, well, and in the Midrash, which is a story that the rabbis made up, is that God asked the Jews to do this thing,
mm-hmm.
and the Jews accepted it, I should say the Israelites, but it's not. But God asked everybody. Basically, God created a world. God created a world which was beautiful.
Yes.
And spiritual and holy, and had all these unbelievable miracles in it. And he was essentially saying, well, this is my universe.
Yes.
So the Jews ran with it. And eventually the Christians, which was also actually an offshoot of Judaism, and even Islam is an offshoot of Judaism also. So the Western religions, they're going with it. So that was one lesson, is basically God's put out the same message to everybody.
Well,
and I never took it as literally God would say, hey, you guys are chosen. It was like, it's more of a metaphor.
Well, my sense of what I was told in the God book is that the Jews were given a particular assignment. The covenant, the laws are a particular assignment to partner with God in history. That the Hindus, people in India, were given a different assignment. So it's the same God, it's a God-given assignment, but they had a different one that had to do with the Atman and, the things familiar from Hinduism. But the Jews had an assignment, and that's what chosen means. Chosen just means you've been tapped to do this job. It doesn't mean other people are chosen for other jobs.
So here's the way I've come
together.
And here's the way I've come to interpret it. Basically, it comes down to, again, the mathematician. So there's three axioms. God created the universe and everything in it.
Yes.
The first thing is there's only one God.
One God. Yes.
God created everything, and including all life, all minerals, everything, the stars, everything.
Mm-hmm.
And the third part of it is that God created mankind, I'm going to say humankind, for a purpose.
For a purpose.
Which is to perfect the world. In other words, God's essentially saying, I've got this world, it's wonderful, but it's not perfect.
Right.
Your job is to make it perfect, to make it better.
Make it better.
So the Israelites are saying, okay, that is their role, but it doesn't preclude other people, and good Christians, and
anybody can help make the world better.
Right. And it helped me to say, listen, because I was uncomfortable as a lot of the new, more modern Jewish movement saying, well, we're chosen, and it's not an exclusive club. It's we're chosen. You're supposed to perfect the world, but other people can be chosen in their way. Now, the other lesson I got is that we all have a relationship to God.
Yes.
It's a personal relationship. And that means that you don't have to go through a rabbi or a priest or a government.
Yes.
And so for example, and not wanting to get too political, but when Jeff Sessions was talking about after this debacle that they had at the border with taking the mothers away from the kids. And then he made a speech and saying, but this is the law, and the government has ordained, God has ordained the government, and therefore the government is right. So when I heard that, instead of just getting angry because I was just offended as a liberal,
Right.
because of all my training now over the last year, I said, wait a minute. First of all, taking a child away from the mother is a sacred bond that has some God. There's a godlike quality to that mother-child relationship.
Sure.
Hey, us men, tread lightly. Don't do that. Don't get in between a mother and their child.
Mm-hmm.
Second thing is, the government is not ordained by God. Every single person has a relationship to God, and the government is not holy. The government is what we as people decide to do to help us to govern ourselves. But the government is not God. Just like I would say, the Pope is not God, the priests are not God, the rabbis are not God. God is God. There's one God.
Yeah.
And there's teachers.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying I wouldn't respect all these teachers and priests and the Pope and so forth.
We have governments and institutions and authorities for a good reason,
Right.
But they're not divine.
And if the government is not acting in accordance with God's rules, which are pretty simple, if God created everything, well, then we have to kind of respect everything. We have to respect that God, God, everybody, every person, reflects the light of God. All the the world is now. Here's it.
As best we can.
And now here's where you get to some interesting problems, which I haven't really talked about with Abigail or other people, and they become good philosophical problems. The world was created by God, and it is our duty, it is our obligation to preserve the beauty of the world. We can't wreck it.
Yes.
Now so that brings up ecology. But so we are using oil, and we are we're hurting the environment. But it doesn't mean that I'm not saying we have to go back to a totally agrarian economy and we can't use any oil and we can't drive cars. First of all, it would be impractical and it wouldn't happen. But now you end up with, now as a society, smart people can get together and say, okay, how do we live in accordance with God's creation? And at the same time, there is a modern economy that
does many other good things.
Does many other things.
Medical services and high technology solutions to problems.
And how do we harness our technology? And technology is a gift from God. The fact that we have a brain that can invent a technology, and we say, well, wait a minute, that's a gift from God. The fact that you and I are both very intelligent people having this conversation.
And we're using this technology that someone thought up.
Right. So this is a modern miracle, what we're doing right now. And the fact that we have the gift to talk about these concepts.
Yes.
But so it also means that we have an obligation to essentially say, how do we make the technology work to make the world perfect or more perfect?
Yeah.
And that I've learned only in the last year.
Yeah, sure.
But it's also something I think we can teach our kids and so forth. And so what I'm trying to do with Temple Judea, I'm still really relatively alone in this. We changed the website. We're talking about enlightened Judaism, some of which I told you. We're saying it's a reset on reform and so forth. But people still don't quite get what I'm talking about because it's.
Well, you're pushing the envelope, right?
Well, it's simple, but it's different. It's like we can be modern and we can be godlike at the same time.
Sure. As you know, toward the end of Got an Autobiography, I'm told to start a theological project called Theology Without Walls. And the kind of lead quote from God in that chapter, in that section, is that you stand on the threshold of a new spiritual era, a new axial age. The first axial age is when all the religions, as we know, or most of them, were formed. The initial round of revelations from God to mankind across the cultures. Well, we stand on a new on the threshold of a new axial age, I'm told. And part of that was starting to think about theology and broader way that God is bigger than our religions. God is manifest through our religions, but no one religion captures the whole of the divine. And someone told me that you were talking about a temple without walls. Is that right, or is that a misquote?
No, it's exactly right. I think we have to reach out to the community. I mean, I think it's dead on. Right. We have to reach out to the community, Christians and Jews and Muslims and so forth.
Yes.
And we have to also get Jews who are not comfortable with institutions to somehow identify, because the basic teachings, which we just talked about, there's one God, God created everything, and we have a purpose to make the world better. If that's your religion, if your religion believes in that and my religion believes in that, then we have a lot more in common. In fact, all the important things we have in common, all the other stuff are trappings.
Yeah.
And religion, which is created by the rabbis or the priests, is not the same thing as spirituality.
Right.
And we get so hung up on the trappings of religion that we're losing the essence of what these religions are. And that's why this is so important, because if we get back to basics now, and then we will cause bridges. I've had arguments I have a brother-in-law who grew up Greek Orthodox, but he was saying, religion gets people in trouble. There's been wars and so forth, which of course is true, because religion separates people. But that's the trappings of religion. That's the institutions of religion.
Sure.
Not the theology, really. The theology there's so much alike.
That's where you think up above at a higher level about your religion and about other religions. And
what does it really teach?
So you're not just, a lot of those wars attributed to religion are really cultural, because people tend to identify their culture often with God,
Right.
So if you're an Irish Catholic, you can't tell your Irishness from your Catholicism often, and so you have these conflicts. But there is a point of view one can take, and part of it is you learn your own tradition, the tradition you're closest to, you grew up in, or that you're drawn to. But you learn what you can about others, and you don't regard them as excluding one another, as if, if you learn from one tradition, that prevents you from learning anything from the others.
Exactly. And tradition's beautiful. So I'm not saying throw out tradition at all. Tradition is beautiful because it reminds us of what the theology is really all about.
Yes.
But on the other hand, but if you want to hold a cross, and I'm going to hold a mezuzah, or so what? I mean, that's what your father told you to do, or your mother told you to do. The reason I'm Jewish is really because my parents were Jewish.
Of course, that's almost the definition.
That's almost very rare. Now, maybe you marry somebody and say, "Oh,
converts.
I'll do that," but that's very rare. But now what I've come to realize is, see, I'm now comfortable saying I'm Jewish. I'm proud of it.
Yes.
I now believe in God. Whereas that teenager who was an atheist, I said, well, he didn't understand what God was all about, because it got mixed up in the trappings of religion.
Right.
And the Bible miracle stories, which were never really explained properly.
Right.
As examples or metaphors or
Right.
Even if they were true.
What the lessons being taught were. Yeah.
A good example was, and this is one I heard from another rabbi, and I think this is great. We know Noah's Ark, and as kids we drew pictures of Noah's Ark, and we might have made a model and put 2x2 things in it, so
little
forth.
Animals.
and fine. I didn't. That's as far as it went. And I've heard debates on YouTube between a scientist and a theologian arguing whether that the Ark really existed.
Yeah, right.
And of course, and it's really almost a not relevant argument, because now here's what the rabbi said. Here's what the story is all about.
Yes.
All of life was in a vessel sailing on the sea. Well, aren't we all on the earth, basically sailing through space?
Yes.
So I had a metaphor for basically all of life is in this really finite. We now know a pretty finite
and fragile, vulnerable.
and fragile and vulnerable, and we're sailing through space, which is vast compared to our little Earth, and we better take care of our Earth. And I said, you know what? That's a beautiful way of understanding it, and that you can teach the kids. That was not how I was taught.
Yeah.
I was the Bible story, and so it was the miracle, period.
Yeah.
And so instead of it basically, hey, you know, and kids will understand ecology and why you have to recycle or do whatever.
Yes. And so with all of the religious, the stories, the verses, the commandments, yeah, we really have to ask, what do they mean?
Right.
And not dismiss them too readily, because you dismiss them too readily, you'll never find out what they mean. You have to kind of ponder them, assume there's some meaning there, because to some extent there's a kind of almost evolutionary principle. If something survives, it must be viable. You know, so it's come down several thousand years. It's got something going for it. Most stuff has not survived that long. The Torah, for example, has.
Judaism is 3,500 years old. It's one of the oldest religions on the earth. So
yes, so you always assume it has the best attitude,
right.
Even if you don't understand it at the beginning or it looks silly, is to think this has something to teach me.
Right.
I'm going to find out why. I'm going to study it until I discover why. Exactly. And I know this is quoted early in God and Autobiography, when I was directed to go read the scriptures of the kind of foundational scriptures of world religions. And I was given a little instruction about how to read them. And I was told, it's not analyzing them. It's not, you know, chopping them into pieces and figuring out how do these pieces go together, or what do they match up with in terms of my general understanding. No, it was to read them and just see, this is back to your spiritual, just see what comes through to you. In other words, just let it speak to you on whatever level, intellectual, emotional, spiritual, whatever, practical, let it speak to you, and let that come in without a lot of karate chopping of the text, you know, up front, so that prevents that meaning from coming through.
Right.
Well, thank you, Joel. I think this has been, I try to keep these a half hour, and it's hard to stop at that point. Here we are. But I will give you a chance if there's some final word or, you know, what, well, let me just ask you this. What's next on your horizon?
Well, I'm hoping, as I said, I'm hoping that Temple Judea rapidly evolves or resets or so forth, that we really reach out to particularly our Christian, and actually there's some Eastern, there's a Hindu church and so forth. There's actually an event on August 12th where the different faiths are getting together over lunch at Temple Judea. I'm hoping that more people who are born Jewish will see the spirituality and come into this, because I'm hoping that, first of all, that the synagogue will be more successful if more people see the value in it. I mean, that's from
a center for everyone.
From a practical sense. But I've also learned, I said, I'm not going out asking for donations. I'm asking people to basically learn what the fundamental spiritual lessons are, and trusting in God that the money is going to be there and the synagogue will prosper. And I feel at peace doing that. And
wonderful. Well, that's a very fine place to conclude, Joel. And I appreciate you. And as you know, I've much admired the leadership you and others have given to the temple, because it's almost, well, it's certainly in a way spiritually thriving, even without having a permanent rabbi present. And maybe that was one of the reasons that there's a kind of the spiritual mission is thrown back on you and other members of the congregation.
Right. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. Okay.
And this work that you're doing, this is important for the reasons we talked about.
Well, thank you, Joel.